Chapter 33: The Building of Global Empires, also known as Imperialism. Modern imperialism is very different from what has been going on that dates back to ancient times. In ancient times, it was more of like little outposts here and there, or trying to have direct rule over another country in a different area. And modern imperialism is very different. Modern imperialism became more about the economy, and it implemented a lot more settler colonies that would grow to have a lot of population from the home country. It became very popular because many entrepreneurs were getting personal fortunes from it. Motives of imperialism. There were many. To start, political motives. Political motives were wanting to have military bases and naval ports around the world that would provide a very good strategic advantage in wars in case one would break out. And another one was control over important canals and places of trade because that would give your economic people better power while stopping enemies from being able to get stronger economic power as well. Economic. Large fortunes were being made by the entrepreneurs that were going out and settling in the different islands because they were going to make companies. They were using and finding the raw materials that were not found in Europe, which was why they were being sold at such a high price in Europe. Petroleum was one of these raw materials. There was a large movement of workers to the new areas that they were finding work in and colonizing. Cultural justification. Religion was often used as a justification because they said that they were civilizing them, in quotes. They were, by converting them to Christianity, they were making them more civilized in their minds. Then the term the white man's burden came along and said that it was the white man's job to civilize other peoples who were not as civilized as them. Tools of imperialism. Transportation tools included steamships, which would cut off transportation time by so much. A trip that would take months from Great Britain to India would now take 2 weeks. They also allowed you to go upstream, which allowed them to explore further into the continents, as well as going against the winds. Canals like the Suez and Panama were very vital because it stopped you from having to go around the southern tip of Africa or South America. And railroads. Once a place was beginning to be colonized, railroads would always be added because they added so much. They cut the transportation time on land in half, at least. Military technologies. There were a lot of new weapons, beginning with upgrades to the muskets, and eventually getting to this new weapon called the Maxim gun. The Maxim gun would shoot 11 bullets per second. It was a machine gun. Because of the invention of the Maxim gun, it allowed for domination over the enemies who didn't have it. Communications. Steamships reduced time to messages, and then the telegraph was invented. The telegraph was a wire that you could send little messages like through Morse code, and eventually there would be submarine cables where they would go through the water. European imperialism. In India, which was mostly Great Britain, it had first started with merchants being placed around in different cities, and then little forts were established on the coast. Eventually, because of seeing the value in the Asian goods that they were trading, more interest would go into India. Secondly, it became company rule, where the little companies were placed around India, and they began to give a little bit more power with Great Britain, but also making treaties with the Mughals, which were in power at the time. Eventually, with the death of Aurangzeb and the Mughal decline began to happen, companies began to have a lot of power and over the Mughal amount. Eventually, Great Britain would start to take over a lot more territory and use the sepoys, which were Indian troops, in their own governments. Eventually, the sepoy would rebel, and because of this, there was brutal British retaliation to the Sepoy Rebellion. Lastly, it had changed from company rule to direct imperial rule. There was a British viceroy who represented India, and the Indians were in low government positions. There was an agricultural reworking to introduce cash crops, and there was more industrialization and implementing English schools into India. Asia. The imperialism in Asia is often referred to as the Great Game. There was the war for India that everyone had thought was going to happen, had never happened. Focus had shifted to Central and Southeast Asia, which had lots of valuable resources as they started to colonize there more and find them. There was Russian hegemony in Asia at the time, so up northern into Asia was kind of off limits. There was a race for Southeast Asia by the rest of Europe after finding the value in the islands. And the two main colonies were British Singapore and Malay. Singapore was the biggest trading post in Southeast Asia at the time. French Indochina was directly next to Singapore, and Siam was the only kingdom left, the only native kingdom left, and it was used. They left it because it was a buffer zone between French Indochina and British Singapore. Scramble for Africa. And early, it had started as small settlements which would trade with little amounts of gold, ivory, and palm oil as it started to become more of a commodity in Europe. There were some missionaries trying to convert native peoples, and early adventurers who would go in to explore. Then there was the Berlin Conference. There was tension between European powers because they all wanted to get a piece of Africa, but they didn't want to start a war. In the Berlin Conference, they allowed for the justification of cutting up Africa into colonies. Everywhere except Ethiopia and Libya had been colonized by some country, and the Berlin Conference allowed it as long as you announced what you were doing and it wasn't encroaching on another person's colony. Ethiopia was the only place left because they were fighting Italian colonization, and Libya was a section of the U.S. being protected by them. The systems of colonial rule. There were started off as concessionary companies being placed around Africa, which would gain power from the home country, and eventually they would begin to abuse their power and abuse the native peoples that they were using for labor, and the powers would be curtailed because it made the people back home unhappy. There were different forms such as direct and indirect rule. Pacific Islands. Again, it had started with little settler colonies. They wanted to rule the coast without the cost of full settling. They wanted to get the resources, but they didn't want to have to fund an entire settle. They didn't want to have to fund an entire settling mission. It had began with countries such as Australia and New Zealand, those territories, and it began with convicts and volunteers. It was convicts at first, but then as they started to see the value and there was finding gold in Australia and fertile soil in New Zealand, then volunteers started to flood in there. Imperialist in paradise. While the imperialists were enjoying their new tropical islands, the diseases had ravaged the indigenous peoples that were there. All but island of Tonga was taken, and they started to see the value in these islands, and it made them kind of like relaxing ports along someone's trip, where you could drink and have your ship fixed while you're relaxing on an island. Emergence of new imperial powers. United States was one of these imperial powers. They had been increasing in strength, but they hadn't really been an imperial power yet. When imperialism had begun to happen, there was Latin America had begun with the United States in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically said in the Western Hemisphere is the U.S. They did not want anyone from Europe or other countries to interfere with the Western Hemisphere. Then there was the Spanish-Cuban-American War, where the Americans blamed the USS Maine on Spain. And they blamed the ship's explosion on Spain and then went to war with them. They took the island of Cuba, and then they would take other islands from them as well because they said they did not want them to be taken by French and Japanese imperialists. Another piece was the Panama Canal, where they had taken land from the country of Panama and just built the canal there. Although it helped trade, it was not just of them to just take the land like that. They also would take all of Spain's other territories in the Pacific area. Japan was a big growing power at this time. Early Japan no longer wanted to be small, and they wanted to be a force to be reckoned with. They had began industrializing earlier, and now it was time that they began colonizing. They started by carving out pieces of China, and China was not strong enough to stop them. And war was a way that they expanded. There was the Sino-Japanese War, where they started fighting over the territories of Korea and then went up into Manchuria. And Manchuria is bordering with Russia, which then leads to the Russo-Japanese War, which was significant because it's the first time that an Asian country had been able to beat a European country in war, and they beat them very easily. So because of this, Japan had gained a lot of prestige and was gaining some respect as a powerful nation. Legacies of imperialism. Empire and economy. There were lots of changes to the economy after imperialism has been in full effect. Societies were giving raw materials, but it did not benefit them because they were often having to give them for no money or as dirt cheap. Cash crops were encouraged in every colony everywhere. They had not only was it giving less food to the people, but it was also having environmental damages because they were clearing huge parts of land, of forest and fields to make large cash crop farms. Labor migrations. More than 50 million migrants had left Europe and gone to other places around the world. European migrants had normally gone to temperate areas, while most Asians who had emigrated had become indentured workers going to subtropical places. Workers from poor countries were relied on all across in all the different colonies. They had taken those people and taken advantage of them, using them as indentured labor. Increased world diversity had also begun to happen because people were moving everywhere. The indentured laborers would arrive and they would work for a certain amount of time in order to earn their freedom. Empire and society. Conflict. There was lots of colonial conflict as well. Well, a lot of them were not strong enough to do anything against their colonizers. There was thousands of rebellions against the British because the British had many colonies. But for the places that were not as powerful, they began to use boycotts and boycotted their colonizers' goods. There was a lot of change in science as well, and science in quotes. There was a belief of scientific racism. Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau produced a false record stating that European peoples had evolved more than any other people in the world, and that's why they were advanced. It began to use Darwinism as the fact and saying survival of the fittest, and how because they had evolved, they were the ones that were the strongest. This idea of popular racism had begun to grow among other peoples in Europe and also started to be used in Japan as too. They saw themselves as superior to their neighbors and used that as a justification to colonize. Nationalism and anti-colonialism. It began in India with Ram Mohan Roy. He had worked with the British, but he supported India. He understood that he could not revolutionize India and make India an independent country without working with the British first. He wanted to bring higher education to Hindus, which he achieved to a certain degree. He criticized the British colonial regime eventually, but he had built up a basis and was not just executed or exiled for it. Then there was the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress was British approved because they were supposed to, which they did, they brought higher education to Hindu people and they brought better treatment and helped to get rid of British racism. And by the end of the 19th century, they had sought self-rule away from the British. They had absorbed Enlightenment values and were using them to justify their to get self-governance. Thank you for listening. That was Chapter 33, Building of Global Empires.